majority of them are in fact disabled. Freddie Gray was a survivor of lead poisoning. Eric Garner had asthma. Quan McDonald had multiple disabilities, including complex PTSD.
Well, hello there, Florida. Where do you think we're going to go with this? This is Florida House Bill 1275, the Persons with Disabilities Registry. It is labeled the Protect Our Loved Ones Act, and what's particularly interesting about it is, you can see it right here in the first paragraph. Essentially, it addresses just about everyone, from certain developmental disorders such as, well, who knows, blank space, psychological or other disabilities or conditions, including but not limited to autism spectrum disorder, Alzheimer's disease or other related dementia disorders, and Down syndrome that may be relevant to the interactions with law enforcement. It means as much as law enforcement should be aware if they interact with an individual with a disability so that law enforcement can act in an appropriate manner. But considering that this is Florida, this could also be used in other ways. But before we go down the obvious dark path, it means essentially in paragraph 2 that the adult can register themselves to be entered into the registry. And then more towards the bottom after the bullet points, an incapacitated adult enrolled onto the registry by another person must be notified of that enrollment by the local law enforcement agency in writing at his or her address of record. So the question then becomes, who is actually behind this particular bill? The bill originated on the Committee on Children, Families and Elder Affairs, and you can see the names here and individually research each individual participant, but particularly interesting is Senator Dennis Baxley, who has presented with rather interesting legal perspectives as well as behaviors, and therein lies one of the many concerns. For the rest of this recording, I'm speculating and pontificating because there is no distinct evidence other than historical reference. If law enforcement in the United States were truly of such nature that they're interested in assisting and honoring the individual, particularly those with disabilities who at times require special care and a specific set of knowledge in form of care, then I'd say that maybe such a list would have merit in enhancing the relationship between law enforcement and the community with disabilities. However, we know how law enforcement can and frequently does conduct itself in the United States.
The simple act of handcuffing a deaf person is a form of violence. If a deaf person uses their hands to communicate, that in and of itself is violent.
I watched this man die. I was the one that was recording the whole thing.
It was a pain so palpable.
And everybody gasped. How do I feel? I don't know how to feel.
Numb. And it started me thinking, why?
It's not right. Things need to be fair, and we need to be treated equally now.
For those of us who are older, it was Rodney King. But for the younger generation who's grown up with social media at their fingertips, it's George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, Mike Brown, and so many more.
It's getting worse and worse every day. It's frustrating for us, people of color.
The vast majority of them are in fact disabled. Freddie Gray was a survivor of lead poisoning. Eric Garner had asthma. Quan McDonald had multiple disabilities, including complex PTSD.
Without any national database on police use of force or police violence, it's very difficult to quantify statewide or nationally. But a study by the Ruderman Family Foundation says a third to half of all use of force incidents involve a disabled person.
That's actually a really low number. Simply because the methodology used to define disability in those studies was very Americans with Disabilities Act specific.
And when it comes to the deaf people involved in these cases, Talila says the vast majority are ethnic minorities.
All except 3 were Black or brown, indigenous. There were several indigenous people.
There's the perception that someone who is a person of color is more dangerous. There's a perception that someone who not responding the way they would expect them to respond or is behaving differently than they would expect them to behave is dangerous. And courts have too often said, well, you know, rational fear, maybe it was okay.
And the historical reference to this is pretty blatant as far as cleaning the population of those who are undesirable. could possibly be, because we've seen it before. And the more people are on lists, particularly the lists of those who are deemed undesirable, the greater the risk for individual communities. And it'd be one thing if we'd have such a list that is published to social services agencies, for instance, or to agencies that are truly invested in enhancing the quality of life for the people who are on the lists. My concern is that law enforcement is not one such agency. Of course, mileage may vary, because this is all now highly speculative, because we have no evidence at this point in time that law enforcement would take such a list and act in the disinterest of the community. But the probability from a historical perspective, as well as the way that law enforcement conducts itself in the United States, really speaks loudly to the idea that there is nothing good that shall follow once people are on lists in a country that is running with 100 miles an hour in the wide open arms of fascism. Let's hold on to, well, hope that it will be used in a responsible, socially responsible, and caretaking manner. Because the alternative is really grim.